Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with part 55, The Modern School of French Kabalism, Book 7, Some Christian Students of the Kabalah from the Doctrine and Literature of the Kabalah by Arthur Edward Waite. 18. The Modern School of French Kabalism. Eliphas Levi died in 1875, having founded, as it must be admitted, a new school of occult philosophy. For the 10 years which preceded his death, he had made no outward sign. There are rumors of the initiations which were offered him and of the rites which he remodeled. But all that is known certainly is that he collected around him a small group of private students who looked up to him as their master, regarded his suggestive speculations almost in the light of revelation, and following his leading, accepted the Kabalah as the great synthesis of religious belief. It was not till another 10 years after his death had elapsed that any visible result of his influence became manifest. During that period, a marked change had come over philosophic thought in Paris. The younger generation broke away from the traditions of positivism and materialism and, without returning to the church, passed off in the direction of mysticism, and mysticism moderated by science became the characteristic of the succeeding epoch. When about the year 1884, the Theosophical Society opened a lodge in Paris and began the publication of a monthly magazine, a proportion of the French mystics gathered round it, and one of the most noticeable in the group was Dr. Gérard Encausse, the young chef de laboratoire of an eminent doctor celebrated in connection with one of the schools of hypnotism. His first contributions appeared in the pages of Le Lotus and his first work, On the Elements of Occult Science, under the auspices of the Society. A rupture, however, took place, and the seceding members, abandoning for the moment their interest in la métaphysique orientée, established, so to speak, a school of Western occultism, of which Dr. Encausse became the moving and leading spirit, and Eliphas Levi the most immediate inspiration of the past. The ostensible characteristics of this school are Neo-Martinism and Neo-Rosicrucianism. But the transcendental conceptions associated with these names have undergone developments which have to some extent effaced their original outlines, so also the admired masterpieces of Eliphas Levi have been a point of departure, quite as much as a guide. It is, broadly speaking, nevertheless, the work of Levi which has been continued, and along with other occult interests, the study of the Kabalah has been revived under the reflected impulsion of his enthusiasm. It has not been so far an exhaustive study, nor has it, I think, been altogether a critical study, for it began by taking too much for granted, and it has not shown a comprehensive acquaintance with the documents. There is, however, no writer of this group who has not had something to tell us concerning Jewish theosophy, while its activity has engendered consequences of much the same kind outside its immediate circle. The two names which most call for notice in this connection are Dr. Gérard Encausse and Stanislas de Guaita. The literary and occult antecedents of the first writer are Saint-Yves d'Alvedre, Fabre d'Olivet, Eliphas Levi, and Adolphe Frank. From the first, he has derived a systematic view of Jewish history. From the second, his notion of esoteric mysteries concealed in the Hebrew language. From Levi, unfortunately, a burden of historical suppositions. And from Frank, an academic precedent for the antiquity of Kabbalistic literature. On the other hand, Stanislas de Guaita belongs to what may be termed the literary school of occultism, and as such he connects with Sarpelladon. I propose to consider the position of both these writers in short subsections, and to connect them with a third who is governed by very different motives and principles. A papus. The word papus signifies physician, and according to a commentary of Eliphas Levi on the Nuctameron of Apollonius, it is the title of a genius belonging to the first hour of that mystic period. It is also the pseudonym adopted by Gérard Encausse, the head of the French Martinists and the leader of occult activity in Paris, presumably because he is a doctor of medicine. Papus is a voluminous writer, methodical and laborious, and he has done work which along its own lines is admirable. From the beginning of his literary life, he has been occupied with Kabbalistic questions, and so far back as the year 1887, he made the first French translation of the Sefer Yetzirah, which appeared in the Theosophical Review Lotus. It is not entirely a satisfactory translation, and has been superseded by that of Meyer Lambert, which Papus himself recommends with the generosity of a true student. The chief blemish of his own version is that by some misconception or error, founded apparently on the use of a dubious word in the Latin rendering of postal, he has made this ancient work responsible for the doctrine of Ein Sof, and it is a point of great critical importance that there is no such doctrine in the Book of Formation. In 1892, Pappus published a methodical summary of the Kabalah, together with a bibliography, which are both useful but are again open to criticism. The bibliography has been constructed upon the most debatable of all principles, viz. The increase of the numerical importance by adventitious elements which are not Kabbalistic at all, and again by the inclusion of works which are evidently unknown to the writer, with results which are occasionally ludicrous. Thus, in the one case, among books in the French language, we find Figuier's Alchemy and the Alchemists, which contains no reference to the Kabalah, Saint Martin's Crocodile, a clumsy satire open to the same objection, Eckartshausen's Cloud on the Sanctuary, also non-Kabbalistic, and a number of esoteric romances which have as much claim to insertion as Baudelaire's translation of Poe. In the other case, Dr. Pappus, who is only superficially acquainted with English, classifies Mr. Massey's translation of Duprel's Philosophy of Mysticism, my own, Lives of Alchemistical Philosophers, Dr. Hartmann's White and Black Magic, a catalogue of second-hand books issued by Mr. Redway, and unfortunate above all other instances, the once celebrated supernatural religion. The bibliography of works in the Latin language is much better done, though it contains some useless numbers. As regards the treatise itself, it has the merit of extreme modesty. It is in fact mainly a series of tabulated quotations from Frank, Loeb, de Guaita, Kircher and so forth, with a number of serviceable diagrams derived from similar sources. It is altogether excellent as a general introduction to the subject by an occultist and for the use of occultists, but it makes the mistake of attributing a real importance to the debased Hebrew influences found in the literature of ceremonial magic. Thus, Dr. Pappus says that the practical part of the Kabalah is barely indicated in a few manuscripts dispersed through our great collections. At Paris, the Bibliothèque Nationale possesses one of the finest examples, of which the origin is attributed to Solomon. Having appreciated in another section the claim of the clavicles to recognition in Kabbalistic literature, it is here only necessary to say that in the work under notice, there is no attempt to justify their inclusion, which is explained by the sympathies of the author, who in this connection owes something to the French version of Molitor. Dr. Pappus has also unfortunately a bias common to the majority of French and English occultists, and by this bias he is led irresistibly to prefer the imperfect equipment of past authority to the result of modern scholarship. In Egyptology, he knows no higher name than that of Coeur de Gebelin. In problems of Hebrew philology, his great master is Fabre d'Olivet, and hence, on the one hand, we shall not be surprised to find that he regards P. Christian as a source of serious information concerning the Egyptian mysteries of initiation, or on the other, that he considers the Hebrew of the Mosaic books to be identical with the idiom of ancient Egypt. The position of writers who base their views on language studies undertaken at the beginning of this century is not really more reasonable than would be that of a person who should now attempt to defend the antiquity of the Rowley poems. But it might be scarcely worthwhile to speak of it were it not for the consequences that it involves, at least in the case of Pappus, as, for example, the descent of the esoteric tradition from Moses and its identity with the mysteries of Egypt, points which, debatable or not, must not be determined after this unscholarly fashion. I have said sufficient to indicate that the historical argument, so far as it exists in Pappus, is altogether unsatisfactory, and there is indeed no need to reckon with it. But his little work is useful as a summary of the content of the Kabalah, though even in this respect it might have been simplified with advantage. As regards the special motive of our own inquiry, the standpoint of Pappus is that the Kabalah is the keystone of all the Western tradition of transcendentalism. That the alchemists were Kabbalists, and so also all mystic fraternities, whether Templars, Rosicrucians, Martinists, or Freemasons, that the source of the Kabalah was Moses, and that Moses drew from Egypt, whence the Kabalah is the most complete summary in existence of the Egyptian mysteries. Why those mysteries should have an absorbing claim on our respect does not appear from Pappus, but the subsurface understanding is undoubtedly that a tradition of absolute religion has been perpetuated from antiquity, and with all his dissemblings and palterings, with all the hindrance of his skepticism, that also is Levi's standpoint. B. Stanislas de Guaita. Associated with the literary work and much of the active propaganda of Dr. Gérard Encausse, the name of the Marquis Marie, Victor Stanislas de Guaita, though scarcely known in England, was much valued in the occult circles of Paris, and his comparatively recent death, at the early age of 36 years, occasioned profound sorrow. I may perhaps observe that outside the immediate circle of his friends and admirers, it is possible to say that he is a real loss to the esoteric literature of France. It will perhaps scarcely be necessary to state that he was a disciple of Eliphas Levi, whose works he regarded as constituting the most cohesive, absolute, and unimpeachable synthesis that can be dreamed by an occultist. If we add to this that de Guaita is described by Pappus as occupying beyond contradiction the first rank among the pupils of Levi, we shall have a fair knowledge of his position. He began his literary life as a poet, and in that character connects with the school of Baudelaire. His mystic preoccupations appear, however, in his verses, and he soon devoted himself exclusively to the occult sciences. His works entitled The Threshold of Mystery, The Serpent of Genesis, and The Key of Black Magic are much admired for their magisterial form, which recalls that of his master. In occult science, de Guaita was chiefly attached to the Kabbalistic tradition, and he considered that in Neo-Mosaic Christianity, explained by the Holy Kabalah and Alexandrian Hermeticism, under certain reserves, the absolute truth must be sought in all knowledge. At an early period of his occult enthusiasm, Stanislas de Guaita founded a Kabbalistic order of the Rose Cross, comprehending 3 grades, to which entrance could be obtained only after successful examination, and the possession of the 3 grades of the Martinist order was an indispensable preliminary condition. When the numerical strength of the association had attained the limits prescribed by its constitution, it was rigorously closed by decision of the Grand Master. De Guaita is termed an erudite Orientalist by his friends, who also mention the Hebrew folios which enriched his library. Finally, it is recorded that he believed himself more thoroughly possessed of the Kabalah than all others. But if we may accept the authority of Dr. Mark Haven, he seems to have distinguished 2 species of Kabalah. The first, a science which no one could teach and no one could learn except with the most arduous toil and by years of sacrifice. For it is more rugged than Ronsky, more diffuse than Spanish mysticism, more complex than Gnostic analysis. And after all, it appears to be only a pseudo-Kabbalah. The other is apparently the Kabalah as presented by William Postel, Nicolas Flamel, Kunrath, Saint-Martin, and so forth. I must confess that this distinction is a puzzle. I know well enough that Saint-Martin was not a Kabbalist, except in the most phantasmal sense and by a most remote derivation. I know that Flamel the alchemist, if he ever wrote anything, was concerned with the transmutation of metals, and not with the mysteries of Ein Sof. It is, however, the Kabalah of such Kabbalists that is said to illuminate the pages of de Guaita and to have inspired his active works. Despite, therefore, of his accredited erudition, the author of The Serpent of Genesis has no message to the serious student of Kabbalism. The Zohar has its difficulties, and by these he was clearly intimidated. But the kind of distinction which de Guaita sought to establish offers at least one point of interest. Postel, Flamel, Kunrath, Saint-Martin are names which stand in his mind for Kabbalistic Christianity, for that marriage of the Zohar and the gospel to which he refers expressly. He differs, therefore, from his fellow propagandist Pappus, who exhibits few Christian sympathies and is attached more consistently to the doctrine of Eliphas Levi. But in de Guaita, as in Levi, it is not the Orthodox Christianity, as understood on the one hand by Mirandola and Postel, or on the other by Rosenroth, with which the Kabalah is connected, but Christianity permeated by Gnostic elements. And this is the special characteristic of all occult students who take any interest in the light cast on the religion of Jesus by the post-Christian developments of Jewish theosophy. Thus, the missionary enthusiasm of the early Christian schools of Kabalism and the messianic dream constructed by Jewry out of the wild elements of the Zohar have been exchanged for an attempt to go back upon the path of doctrinal development and to discover in the analogies between the Kabbalah and the Gnostics a practicable thoroughfare into the debated regions of esoteric religion. As disappointment waited on the mistaken ardor of the first zealots, so it is possibly in store for the revived zeal in Kabbalism. C. Léon Murin, S.J. Having to establish some points of connection between the Kabalah and Freemasonry, it seems just to include among Kabbalistic students the most laborious investigator of this subject, the late Archbishop of Port Louis. It is true that his large treatise, Freemasonry, the Synagogue of Satan, is a product of the troubled dream of the papacy concerning the liberi muratori, and is saved only by the sincerity of its intention from a place in bogus literature. It is true also that it connects with a squalid imposture long since unmasked, but it shows a considerable acquaintance of the superficial order, both with Kabbalistic doctrine and Masonic symbolism. And it is worth noticing how the transcendental tradition of the Jews was appreciated quite recently by a Catholic critic who was also an ecclesiastic of some eminence and a member of the Society of Jesus. It is unnecessary to say that it is an entirely hostile criticism. In place of the Orthodox synagogue and the true doctrine of Moses, which God himself inspired, modern Kabbalists represent the paganism with which certain Jewish sectarians became imbued during the captivity of Babylon. We have only to study their doctrine and to compare it with those of civilized nations in antiquity, Indians, Persians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Egyptians, Greeks, and so forth, to become assured that the same pantheistic system of emanation is inculcated by all. We find everywhere an eternal principle emanating a primeval triad, and thereafter the entire universe, not by creation, but by substantial emanation. Hence, we are compelled to recognize a close connection between Kabbalistic philosophy and ancient paganism, which is difficult to explain except by the inspiration of the same author, in other words, the lying spirit who is the enemy of mankind. The entire treatise may be regarded as the development of this paragraph, which, it must be confessed, is the view that would be taken inevitably by the Latin Church. We have seen that under the auspices of Christian Kabbalists, with Picus de Mirandola as their mouthpiece, there was for one moment a sign of rapprochement between the Church and the Jewish tradition, but it was impossible in the nature of both, and the Church was saved then, as it has been occasionally saved since, as if by some happy intuition which preceded any real knowledge of the interests at stake. The general position being thus defined with perfect accuracy by Master Murin, he proceeds at a later stage to develop his impeachment by exhibiting the fundamental error of all pantheism, that, namely, which concerns the transition of the infinite to the finite, which wears, he tells us, for any serious thinker, the aspect of a fraudulent device. Basing his argument on the well-known verse in Wisdom, "Thou hast ordered all things in measure and number and weight," he advances that we must seek in these the distinction between the infinite and the finite. For these categories do not exist in God, or rather they are elevated above themselves and lost in a superior unity. Creation out of nothing is the only rational solution of the grand problem concerning the origin of a world which is governed by number, weight, and measure, a doctrine which assumes no passage from infinite to finite, since it does not derive the universe from the divine substance by an emanation of any kind. It is true that ex nihilo nihil fit, but in the creation, there is not only the nihilum, there is also the omnipotent. And it is untrue to say that with nothingness and the all-powerful, nothing can be made. Ex nihilo nihil fit deo would be a false axiom. In a study like the present, it would be entirely out of place to discuss the points at issue between emanationists and creationists. The Kabalah is a system of emanation, and it is so far opposed to the official doctrine of Orthodox religion on a question of fundamental philosophy. I think personally that the better reason is on the side of the hypothesis of emanation, on the simple ground that the conception of nihilum cannot coexist with that of an infinite God. I shall be told, of course, that I'm confusing the notion of endless space with that of the divine nature, but as God is everywhere by the hypothesis, there is no place which is not filled by his power and his presence. And then where is the nihilum? But the whole controversy concerns a res ardua et difficilis, as Isaac de Loria would have termed it, which fortunately cannot produce a single consequence of importance to the human mind. though it is precisely to such arid speculations that official orthodoxy has always sought to attach an eternal consequence for the soul. Master Morin remains, however, the consistent and correct exponent of the church which he represents. And so far as this church is concerned, he has registered, as we must admit fully, the heretical nature of Kabbalistic doctrine. We may go further and allow that in other places he scores occasionally a logical point against it. I think that no intelligent person can well deny the intellectual clumsiness with which the system of Sephirotic emanation is presented in works like the Greater Sacred Synod. We have, for example, such notions as the commencement of thought in Ein Sof, which precedes the emanation of understanding, thus reversing the psychological order as the prelate well observes, besides formulating an absurdity concerning the one being in whom there is no beginning. It may well be that in the last analysis these things are to be understood more profoundly than is suggested by their surface meaning, but they are crude and misleading enough in their outward sense. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much,